Organizations are constantly working on steps to beat cybercriminals, to keep the cyber security threats at bay. But are the steps really helping? In a survey, 9 in 10 respondents said that although their organizations were running up-to-date cybersecurity protection, they were hit by an attack. Organizations are increasingly failing to build walls that can ward off security breaches. Ladies and gentlemen, to discover how to beat the cyber attackers, how synchronized security enables your cybersecurity products to work together as a system, we have with us today Mr. Ben Verschering, Global Solution Engineer, Sophos. Ben has more than 15 years of experience within the IT industry, with experience in both sales and engineering. Before I hand it over to Ben, I would request you all to be please present till the end of the webinar and answer the feedback form. Also put your questions in the chat window, which we can address during the Q&A session. Thank you so much. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you so much, Krishna, and thank you everyone for attending today. As Krishna said, my name is Ben Verscharen. I'm a Global Solutions Engineer at Sophos, and it's my job to essentially understand and interpret the cyber threat landscape and understand what attackers are doing on a daily basis and work in to mitigate those techniques and also educate the masses. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the impossible puzzle of cybersecurity. To give you an idea, it's been developed out of an independent survey that Sophos commissioned by a company called Vance & Bourne. And I think it's really important to understand why we do this. And by us going out to market as Sophos, we can get an idea of where cyber attacks are at and where cyber attacks are coming from. But by commissioning a third party, we can get a much greater unbiased reach and use the information that we collect to help shape Sophos as an organization, but also help educate the masses. And what does that mean for you attending today? Well, I want you to think about it like this. If you've got concern about cybersecurity, as you probably do because you have joined, you can understand where your peers are currently at with cybersecurity as well. So with everybody that's attended the call today, you will know roughly where they are and how they feel about cybersecurity, so you know that you're not alone with this impossible puzzle of cybersecurity. So with that, what I do want to do is introduce to you the demographic that we went after to commission this report and understand the state of cybersecurity. So between December and January, so December 2018 and January 2019, we went out to 3,100 decision makers, and they were of both small to medium enterprise, so, you know, the smaller companies, and then we went from between 1,000 to 5,000 employees, so the more enterprise end of the market. Now, there may be some of you on the call today to say, well, I'm above 5,000. Do these statistics still apply to me? And the answer is very much yes. You find that once you get to about 5,000 employees, the challenges remain the same. It's a very hard ship to steer. It's a big ship. It's a Titanic almost. So whether it's 5,000 employees or 50,000 employees, you'll find that the challenges remain. And as you can see, of the 3,100 that we interviewed, 300 of them were from India. So there was a decent demographic and representation from India for this particular report. Now, one of the most alarming statistics for me when it came to this is 2 out of 3 organizations fell victim to a cyber attack in 2018. So that means that of the hundreds of you on the call today, more than a third of you, in fact 2/3 of you, have experienced a cyber breach, and hopefully it wasn't too stressful, and hopefully you remained intact with your job still safe. However, you should take some kind of solace in knowing or comfort in knowing that you weren't alone. You weren't the only one on the call today that has experienced a cyber breach. So the number is huge and it's quite alarming, but it's happening to everybody. You're not alone. Cybersecurity is an increasingly hard puzzle to solve. So, of everybody that experienced a cyber breach, they actually experienced, on average, two forms of breaches throughout their time as an IT manager in their current position. So that doesn't mean that an attacker was successful once. They learnt from their lessons and they tightened up their security, and they went stricter on policies and never experienced a cyber breach again. As you can see from this, from those that were breached, on average, there was 2 attacks per organization, successful attacks on organizations. But sadly and surprisingly, 10% of people that experience a cyber breach experience 4 or more attacks that successfully got through their defenses. Now, I don't know about you on the call today, but I feel like that's an alarmingly high number. If you've experienced 4 or more attacks on your organization that were successful in this case, it's probably a good time to start reviewing what you're doing as a security breach. We're running what they thought was up-to-date cybersecurity practices, so architecture and things like that, or up-to-date traditional endpoint protection and traditional firewalling. So they had the assumption that what they had was in fact secure and safe because it was up-to-date. Now, 9 out of 10 is actually incredibly high. We know that patching on the internet and we know that patching of systems is generally a lot lower than 90%. So for 9 out of 10 people to say that they knew that their systems were up to date means that they had emphasis and were working on cybersecurity in an effective manner, but what they were doing maybe wasn't the right strategy to employ. And that leads on to the multiple areas of concern. So we know that 2/3 of people have experienced a cyber breach, but what are the actual concerns there? What do people care about? So, funnily enough, the number one concern for 31% of IT managers was data loss. And it was a top 3 concern for 68% of people. The thing is that you then had damage to business and the cost. And the number one concern for 21% of IT managers is both damage to business and cost. So time and money, so resources that were, say, working on a data breach. The thing is all 3 of these pillars that came up as a top concern and a number one concern for a lot of people is they all relate to each other. For example, if you lose a huge amount of data, that's going to cost time and money, and it's also going to do damage to your business. So they all interlink, and you need to think there's regulations now globally, like GDPR, for example, that affect everybody. So you might be an organization, you may have some European customers, and unfortunately, you need to then succumb to compliance and policies. And if you look at Facebook, they've been fined a number of times. They're an American entity, but they're being prosecuted under GDPR. So as an organization out of India, you do need to be concerned still to say, okay, well, if I experience a data loss, it's going to cost me money, whether it's fines from the European Union or whether it's just resources to recover from this attack. And what's going to happen once my name appears in the public? What are people going to do? So data loss, damage to business, and the cost are all 3 pillars that you need to think about as an IT manager. There's some smaller factors in here as well. Dealing with compliance and auditors. Not a lot of people said they don't have any concern, and a few people said they don't know. But you do need to have a think. If you experience a data breach, what would your area of concern be, and how would you mitigate that potential problem? So, why are organizations still struggling? Why are they struggling to reduce this cybersecurity risk? And it's very simple. Like, attacks are coming from multiple directions, and I find this fascinating. So from the people that we surveyed, we know that email is still the primary attack vector. So 33% of people that experience a breach first originates from email. And I see that time and time again. Whether it's business email compromise, whether it's a phishing campaign, or whether it's directly delivering malware. There's a number of different ways to attack people via email, and it is still the easiest way to get in. And one of the things I experience as someone that does pen testing and red teaming and focuses a lot on offensive security is an organization can reduce their digital footprint. They can have a really clean online footprint. However, if their users are still happy to click on an email, then being phished is the best way to break into that organization still. Web is still up there. So 3 in 10 attacks we found used a browser or were in browser. And that generally, again, starts with a phish and maybe goes to a malicious web page or it's malvertising. What was fascinating, though, is software vulnerabilities were up at around about 23% of attacks. But the most alarming statistic here is 35% of attacks out of India came from a software vulnerability. And there's a few theories behind that I do want to explore at a later date, so we'll talk about that momentarily. But the other factor that I found interesting was the USB and external devices. And quite a few people discount the risk of a USB drive or an external device getting plugged into a system. And that's okay. You can be skeptical of these attack vectors. However, we found that 14% of attacks still came from a USB drive. Now, that might not be an adversary simulation, like you see the hackers on the movies drop a USB drive in a car park or, slip it into somebody's bag just waiting for them to plug it in. And we hear all of these really great stories from hackers at DEF CON and other hacking conventions talking about the peripherals and the USB drives that they can try and slip in to a POS terminal or, the reception at a hotel. But the other thing to think about is malware, and malware is still transmitted a lot via USB. So don't just think about this active hacker and, this nation state hacker. You also need to start thinking about malware that's being spread from these as well. And fascinatingly enough, 25% of attacks in Mexico started from a USB drive. The most alarming statistic overall is 20% of recipients didn't know how the attack started. They didn't know how the attack got in, which means that they didn't have any root cause analysis or EDR or threat case generation or a digital forensic specialist that could come in and demonstrate exactly how that threat came to be or how that cyber attack came to be. So you can see a really great breakdown here of the different countries. And if you're looking for India, India is on the far right. And you can see that if we break down the attacks, 20% of attacks came in via email. So phishing was quite low for India. 32% via compromised or malicious websites, which isn't as high as some nations, but still quite high. And 35% come in via vulnerable software. Now, this is something that you're going to hear a little bit during today's presentation, and you need to be aware of software. And a few people have challenged me to say, well, why is India so high with software? And it's actually because India is actually one of the highest nations when it comes to software piracy. And I don't know how many people on the call today know if they're running pirated software within their organization. However, one of the biggest issues with pirated software is often it doesn't receive patches and updates from the vendor. So if you are using pirated software within your enterprise, unfortunately, it introduces a software vulnerability risk. So if you can, you want to try and mitigate any potential unlicensed software within that, within your organization. But that's why India is so high when it comes to software vulnerability, or at least that's the hypothesis behind that statistic. So there's multiple security risks, and as I mentioned earlier, phishing's always at the top, and people consider that as a top 3 security risk, as well as software exploitation, but people as well. And when it comes to people, a lot of people go straight to thinking about oh, it's because an internal staff member or a contractor or a visitor is going to get phished. It's going to be their fault. But you even need to think beyond phishing. There's a number of adverts on dark market websites or, under dark market forums, or dark web forums, I should say, where people are actually advertising for insiders to say, if you work for a profitable organization and you're in the position where you can access information that you shouldn't have access to, or you've got access to information that could affect a share price, let us know, because we're willing to pay you for that. So you really need to think about the insider threat and not just say, oh, my user's going to get phished and I need to worry about people. They are the most insecure part of my network. You actually need to worry about culture and how happy people are and how much access they have to particular information. So there's a number of different factors that IT managers listed as their top 3 concerns, and this is the top 5 out of that. Interestingly enough, insecure wireless networking was quite high. For those of you that have got any Microsoft servers in your organization, one of the best ways to deal with wireless networking is just to turn on radius authentication and make sure your Active Directory is quite clean. But the other problem we have is not just attacks coming from multiple directions, and there's so many different attack vectors you need to worry about. We then have to worry about attacks that are multi-staged and they're coordinated, and we like to use the term blended. And when I say blended, it's quite interesting. So a number of years ago, we used to say, oh, targeted attacks, and the media have always held on to this term targeted attacks, which makes sense to a degree. However, most attacks, unless you are working in the government or a government contractor or potentially a bank, someone that's got something really, really valuable, chances are an attack starts out opportunistically. So an attacker might mass scan the internet. So the cybercriminal will scan the internet and try and find any, look for credentials on a dark web market and say, cool, I now know how I'm break into that organization. They will then log into your systems and decide whether it's a valuable target or not, and then that attack goes from being opportunistic to then a targeted attack. So we call those blended attacks. So if we talk about multi-stage attacks, they're very much becoming the norm. Now, what you're seeing here is, again, security managers' top 3 concerns. And as you can see, the percentages here far exceed that 100% mark. And that's demonstrate how big a concern a lot of these vulnerabilities are, or these attack vectors are to people. So 53% of attacks come from phishing. We're not surprised by that. But then we've got 35% software exploitation as a concern, 41% data breaches, 35% malicious code, credential theft. Credential theft is quite fascinating because quite often it starts with a phish, and then once an attacker is in your system and broken in, they try and harvest more credentials, so do be mindful of that. And of course, we've got the elusive ransomware here now as well. I don't think I need to talk about phishing too much. I think I've emphasized enough already how devastating phishing can be to an organization. One of the good things about India is phishing is actually quite low as an attack vector compared to, say, Germany or the UK or Brazil, which are all sitting quite high on this chart. But it's still the preferred attack vector based on what we spoke to, and the most common attack vector for breaking into an organization. You've then got the software exploitation, and we came to an average of 35% here. But the number of people in India, as you can see here on the right-hand side, that fell victim to a software exploitation attack was at 41%. So the number here is incredibly high. And these are things that you need to think about. And there's mitigations you can put in place. There's anti-exploitation technology now, as well as intrusion prevention on your firewalls to detect these attacks over the wire, or detect these attacks in a method that's very similar to patching. So you do need a patch early, you do need a patch often in order to try and mitigate this particular risk. And we know it's a challenge in India based on what we've seen here. So as a takeaway from today's call, I would highly recommend that you investigate some effective patching mechanisms and ways to mitigate software exploitation as a risk to your organization. And of course, we've had some people say ransomware's dead, crypto mining's the next big thing, or, there's been a speculation over what the next big thing is when it comes to extorting money out of innocent organizations. But you can still see that on average, 30% of organizations were infected with ransomware at some point. Poor Japan was sitting in at 50% and India at 39%. So India is very much a target from cybercriminals to infect with ransomware. Well-tested backups are absolutely crucial in this market. Ransomware is not going anywhere. We know that cyber effective. They've retired on $200 million US, as well as their affiliates retiring on similar money. So with so the third people take some time off to put my daughters to bed and to feed them, maybe take them to the park, but then I'm straight back at my computer a couple hours later because I have to be constantly online because the security is becoming more complex and talent is in short supply at the moment. So we found that by interviewing stakeholders that we found that 26% or a quarter of an IT team's time is spent on IT security. And that doesn't just say the security team is spending a quarter of their time. That's saying that the IT as a group is spending roughly a quarter of their time just focusing on security. That's time that's not being spent on innovation or improvement or patching. Well, hopefully patching's included with that. This is more responding to a threat. In India, it was quite alarming. You're the highest nations at 32% of IT teams' time being dedicated to IT security. So it's quite a high number there. And bringing expertise, again, is so difficult. So as you can see here, the respondents that agree with recruiting people with quality cybersecurity skills is still a challenge. And India was up at 89% of agreement. And what I find amazing by this is India as a nation is incredibly talented at IT security, one of the best. If you look at qualifications and the people that are actively working in security, there is a lot of talent in India, but still there's not enough, or everyone's happy with their roles and aren't really moving on. So recruiters are struggling to find the right people, and on average 8 in 10 people said that it is difficult to find the right skills. So keep this in mind if you are being frustrated when it comes to finding people. And of course it comes down to budget, and again, India topped the charts here at 81%. So people thought that their IT security budget was below what it needs to be. And it makes sense if we go back to the previous slide. 32% of IT teams' time out of India is focused on cybersecurity, but you need to have the right people working on it, so you're not investing as many resources and hopefully not spending as much money. But then where does the money come from if you experience a breach as well? These are all questions you need to ask yourself. So really, cybersecurity has become this impossible puzzle. There's a huge amount of technology innovation, technology that you may have invested in many years ago, or even 2 or 3 years ago, might not be relevant for today's threats. So just because you've architected your network in a certain way, or just because you've invested in a certain amount of technology, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily the right way going forward based on the current threat landscape. We know that time, skills, and budget are difficult here as well. We know that not every board and not every CEO wants to spend a lot of money on cybersecurity. However, it is becoming more and more of an area where people need to invest and not take money away from. And as I said earlier, you're on this call today with hundreds of your peers. And sadly, if you could all unmute and speak at a single time, you would probably all agree that now cyber attacks are becoming the norm. You're probably fighting them off on a regular basis. If you're not directly part of your IT security team, I am curious to know if you've ever asked the question, well, how many attacks have we successfully defended against? And I think you'll find that your security team or your IT team will tell you it's incredibly high. And it's purely because attacks are happening on a daily basis and you need to be proactive and stop these. So that begs a question. You've heard all of this. You've seen the challenges from your peers around the world today, and you now might need to ask that question. Well, is it time for a different approach? What can we do different? What is the magical answer? And it's a fair question to ask. And this is comes down to a little bit of Sophos's theory on how to innovate and how to grow as an organization. And if you talk to your IT team, they will probably complain that they have multiple management consoles, and we see that all the time. Is where do they log into to deal with a different problem? Do they need to export data out of one system and then compare it with another system? And you find yourself just continually piling point products on top of each other, trying to get to this nirvana or this happy place where you don't need to focus so much on trying to buy a single vendor that only has their product in mind and no other product in mind either. So when you've got a point product and that 32% of time that's dedicated by IT teams to focus on security, sense. So then we need to think about, well, what can we do? And this is Sophos's approach, and we've been working for years on what we call cybersecurity as a system. So to give you an idea, all of our products are working together with one another. So you might have a system that starts sending out a huge amount of emails. Our email gateway is able to say to the endpoint, hey endpoint, I've seen that you've just sent out thousands of emails. Have you been infected with something nefarious? Do I need to know anything? Do I need to isolate this machine? Do I need to do something to stop this particular threat? Or the firewall can query the endpoint to say, hey, I've seen some strange traffic. You're talking out to an untrusted IP address. Should you trigger a scan? Should we do some more investigation? And we have this constant sharing and collaboration between our products. We also aim to have a single management console that are all compatible by design. And of course, they've got APIs that join all of that together so you can enjoy a synergy and pull this kind of information out of our system as well for third-party consumption. But from Sophos's mantra, everything that we've built in the last 4 to 5 years has been focusing on having this one ecosystem, cybersecurity as a system, to essentially address what we're seeing when we commission these kind of reports to try and find out what the challenges are for IT teams. And it makes sense. Like if we look at one modern day attack, we know that the initial attack is generally phishing or a malicious URL or some form of command and control. But we then know attacks are multi-stage. We talk about this earlier. And then you've got that second stage of attack to say, okay, well, I've broken in. What do I do now? Do I try and buy some more credentials, or do I try and harvest some more credentials and put them up for sale or use them against the organization? Should I try and privilege escalate? Should I try and get some malware onto the system? But of course, like every attack, there's a reason why someone's breaking in. And in the 90s and early 2000s, people used to break into IT systems for fun. It was a challenge and an experience, and the attackers were just doing it for fun. Unfortunately now, things have changed. Attackers are doing it for profit. Cybercriminals are out there to make money. You don't see people online bragging about attacks anymore to say, look how talented I am. I broke into this organization. No. You see people bragging online, or you see groups online like GandCrab, and you trace their Bitcoin wallet, and you can just see that they're making millions upon millions of dollars and very successful at it. So if you're wondering why cybersecurity has got harder, it's because of this ultimate goal. People want to either steal your data, they want to encrypt your files, and they want to extort money out of you. The end game for any attacker nowadays is purely to extort money out of you as an organization. So do keep this in mind when, the board or when your boss won't let you spend any money or invest in cybersecurity. It's always good to give them a bit of a reminder to jump online and have a look at the modern attack techniques of a cyber criminal and understand how much money they are investing in attacks. So it's worth you investing money to try and mitigate these attacks as well. So we do want to open it up for Q&A. But if you want to read our full report, you can go to www.sophos.com/puzzle. That's going to take you to the full white paper that we've written in great detail by our researchers about this impossible puzzle of cybersecurity. You do need to make sure your protection is 100% up to date. You don't want to be part of that 10% that aren't protected. I can't emphasize that enough. You need to continually improve and continually invest in cybersecurity. And of course, I mentioned earlier about this synergy between products, is sharing of information. And of course, you can go to www.sophos.com/synchronized and have a look at what we're offering from a cybersecurity perspective and a telemetry sharing perspective, and how we're trying to create this nirvana, or how we've created this amazing ecosystem of all of our security products talking together to create security as a system. So hopefully these statistics have been insightful for you today. I do want to open it up to everybody on the call to ask me any questions about cybersecurity or anything that you've seen today, so we can elaborate and have a bit more of a conversation. So, Krishna, I do want to open it up to the floor now.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Ben, for those insights. Really alarming, the statistics you have mentioned about India. Thanks for bringing forth all the statistics. I would request my audience to ask questions to Ben. This is a very good opportunity to ask any kind of question to Ben on cybersecurity. Meanwhile, Ben, I have received this question. If you can just help with an answer.
Yep.
Yeah. So, what's a good way to mitigate phishing aside from technologies such as spam filters?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And one of the things that I like to talk about is security as a culture. So phishing, we saw, is such a high number and such an easy attack vector when it comes to cyber criminals breaking into your organization and doing malicious things. So instead of just focusing on, say, spam filtering and hoping it's going to be okay, I highly recommend looking at things like user awareness training. Sophos has a product called Phish Threat, but there's a number of different things out there where you can essentially phish your own users and identify who's more than likely to click on a malicious email. And from there, either talk to the person and deliver some training to the individual to say, hey, you need to be alarmed and concerned, go to somebody that reported the phish to the IT team or the security team to say, hey, is this malicious or not? And then praise that person and reward that person. It's really important to create a positive cybersecurity culture. And one of the best ways to do that is to phish your users, understand who is a high risk in your organization and deliver training to them, but also praise those that are proactive and report things to IT, because they're your cybersecurity champions in your organization.
Yeah, that's true. They are the champions. Thank you, Ben. Ben, this is question number 2, that how to upskill my ICT team. Like when it comes to cybersecurity, how we can gear up for keeping such threats at bay.
Yeah, great question. So it's a difficult one when it comes to upskilling an IT team. Not everyone is aware of the modern attack techniques of an attacker. So when it comes to skilling your IT team, I highly recommend courses like it's called the OSCP, the Offensive Security Certified Professional. And what it will do is train your users on what attackers actually do, and hopefully will give your IT team the chance to learn and understand how to mitigate those risks. And it's really important to stay on top of that and constantly relearn. So if you've got someone in your team that is excited by technology and excited by security, and they've done a course many years ago, it's always worth looking at revisiting and looking at what other courses they can do or what they can do to upskill and relearn to make sure they're still trying to mitigate a modern attack or a modern threat vector. We see this time and time again. So there's certifications like the OSCP, there's a certified ethical hacker, there's a number of different official certifications that's worth pursuing as an IT professional to make you a better system administrator.
Great. So any question? Naveen, can you spot any question? Anybody raising hands? Okay. So Ben, I think, okay, I could see that a few hands over there. Naveen, can you just unmute them so that they can ask the question to Ben directly?
Hi Ben, this is Emmanuel. Can you have any tools for finding the phishing issue?
Sorry, you able to repeat the question, Emmanuel?
Can you please repeat the question? He is asking for tools for phishing.
Actually, can you have any tools to find any infected or happen in my system, in my organization? So you have any special tool for that?
So there's tools like EDR that let you hunt for threats and look for things that are malicious. So endpoint detection and response essentially turns your endpoint into a database of which you can then search and collate, say, PowerShell executions and other bits of code execution that a modern attacker may be using. From a phishing perspective, there's a number of free tools like the social engineering toolkit that would let you phish your users and see who clicks on the link. You could also go to sophos.com and sign up to a trial of, we've got a tool called Phish Threat. So if you signed up for a trial for Phish Threat, you can actually phish 100 people in your organization for free for 30 days and understand who your highest risk users are and see what the success rate is.
Okay, thanks Ben.
No worries, thank you, Emmanuel.
Thanks, Ben. Naveen, can you just unmute Shushant? Yeah, Shushant, please go ahead with your question to Ben. Shushant, can you hear us? If you can just go ahead with your question to Ben. Naveen, we can't hear Shushant. Can we just move on to Ravind?
Hi Ben, this is Ravinder, and I have a question regarding, let's say somebody is already attacked by phishing, and inside the network we have one, let's say one local system who is now supporting that phishing from inside. Now, is there any tool which can find out, because when you see from outside, it will give you only a public IP which is on your router, right? So is there any tool which we can actually install on a local network to find out which is the system which is triggering so many, supporting that phishing attack?
So that's a great question. So that's something that comes down to technology. So if you're using an email gateway at the moment, hopefully it does outbound mail scanning. And if you do outbound mail scanning, it should detect when an endpoint is spamming, say, thousands of emails out of an organization within a short period of time, and alert you to that fact as well.
Okay.
Yeah. Otherwise, if your firewall has got intrusion prevention turned on, quite often a firewall will have an intrusion prevention technology that is looking for outbound heuristics on mass email and hopefully alert you to that.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Ben.
There's a quick question from Rajesh as well. It was sent to me privately, sorry.
Yeah, please go ahead, Ben.
Yep.
Yeah, please answer. Yeah.
So the question was, have you calculated how much bandwidth does the synchronized security require in a LAN? And the answer is very little. It's UDP traffic, and there's keeper lives that are sent, which are a single packet. And then when there looks to be a problem, further telemetry is requested. But it's not noticeable at all. It's very, very lightweight.
Great, thanks, Ben. Naveen, can we unmute Sushant once again? Sushant, please go ahead with your question. We can't hear Sushant yet. Okay, Naveen, just see if we can move on to some other attendees, whoever is raising hand. Meanwhile, Ben, let me ask you a question. Like in this evolving era of cyber threat landscape, what all things we need to unlearn and we need to relearn? If you can just throw some light on that fact.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I could probably do a full webinar on everything you need to learn and relearn. But to keep it high level,
in a nutshell, if you can just help with an answer.
Yeah, so at the moment, there's a common attitude that attacks aren't sophisticated unless you're a government organization or a bank or a government contractor. And that mentality is generally reflected when it comes to board members, especially in really large organizations. So it's important to understand what attackers are doing, as in from a threat landscape. It's not just for fun now. There's a huge amount of profit. So you need to understand that attackers are breaking in and trying to do as much harm and damage as possible to extort money. The other thing is when it comes to network architecture and cloud, is once upon a time people were very open to devices that could come onto their network, and there was a trend of BYOD. Those days are now over, and you now need to think about things like zero trust networking, where every device is isolated and you use infrastructure and software as a service to collaborate as a team, but each end user device is actually malicious. So network architecture needs to change and adapt for the current threat landscape to assume that every user and every device is a risk.
That's true. Thanks, Ben. So the impossible puzzle of cybersecurity, like coming to the theme of today's webinar, how do you think that we can, solve the impossible puzzle of cybersecurity? Some key takeaways.
Yeah, so budget is really important, and understanding that what was successful even 2 years ago, even 12 months ago, might not be a successful mitigation for where are today. So things like anti-exploitation technology and focusing on signatureless protection as well. So just to give you an idea, for example, is Sophos Labs sees 400,000 unique malware samples every day. It's a rising number. So when it comes to protection, Sophos is now thinking about proactive technologies, whereas we can look at behavior and use things like machine learning to actually mitigate these risks and threats, knowing that things like heuristics is good for the once-off bit of malware that might slip through defenses, but we can't expect, technology to require constant updating and identities and signatures. So it's about this proactive, innovative, signatureless technology to provide the best level of protection.
That's really great thing. Thanks, Ben, for throwing light on that front. So what do you think that when it comes to Indian organizations, where are they lagging? Like, why are they not gearing up to ward off such security? Like you mentioned some of the alarming statistics. So how to, keep how to ward off and how to create that robust wall, and where the Indian organizations are lagging?
Yeah, great question. And, I talk to a lot of Indian organizations, and I'll be honest, you've got a lot larger enterprises than the rest of the world. And that's a challenge. That makes it much harder because there's so many people to try and educate and respect technology and security. So where I think you need to improve as enterprises, and this is the same across the world, but I'm going to really emphasize this for India, where there's so many large organizations, is you need to work on how do you change a culture and how do you proactively train your users. And that comes down to what I was talking about earlier, where it comes to having champions in your organization. So your security team doesn't just have to be the people you pay to be security professionals. You can have someone in the accounting team and someone in the payroll team that might have an interest or might just be proactive and naturally suspicious, and use them to raise awareness as well. So find your champions within the organization. They don't have to be an IT person, and then use them, educate them, and praise them and reward them for sharing positive outcomes and positive news and helping build security as a culture. But without changing a culture in an organization, it is incredibly hard to stop modern day threats.
Great. That's really great, Ben. Any global cues, like any leaf we can take out of global adoption, like whatever global companies are doing, we Indian companies, if we can adopt certain facts that would help us to mitigate certain attacks?
Yeah, great question. So you might have seen that in one of the earlier slides I mentioned that India is actually the highest country when it comes to being attacked by software exploitation. And a lot of that comes from out-of-date software, and some of it, sadly, from pirated software as well. One thing that's a great way to handle the cost of software, but also handle security, is software as a service. And one thing that I'll say about a lot of organizations, especially within Australia and New Zealand and the UK, is they've been very heavy adopters of software as a service, things like Office 365. So the reason why I promote software as a service is because software as a service is constantly being updated and it's constantly being patched. So organizations that are, say, using Microsoft Office 365, although I'm not a huge Microsoft fan, but I won't talk about that today, organizations that are, say, using Office 365 also have licensed versions of Microsoft Office, and Microsoft are continually patching office, so you know that latest techniques and mitigations that are being patched and put into software is going straight to the end user. So software as a service is a great way to mitigate software exploitation, and we've seen that trend reflected with the statistics out of Australia and New Zealand and a lot of the UK as well, which are huge adopters of the cloud and software as a service.
Yeah, that's true. Thanks a lot, Ben. Naveen, can we just reach out to Sushant once again if he can ask his question? Let us give us a try. Sushant, please go ahead with your query. Yeah, unable to hear you. Okay. Naveen, it's okay. I think there is some communication gap which is happening. We are unable to hear him. Meanwhile, Ben, as we close this webinar, please do let me know what would be your final word which we can take today.
That puts me on the spot. No, I would, as I said earlier, this desire to relearn and re-educate, and just remember that just because something is secure today doesn't mean it's going to be secure tomorrow. So is insisting on change from a security perspective. Don't have this attitude of, well, we just did a security project 18 months ago or 2 years ago. Why would I do this again? This looks like change for the sake of change. You need to listen to the team and look at the threat landscape and know that changes and evolution is the only way to survive.
Thank you so much, Ben, for your thoughtful insights. That was an enlightening session, I must say that. So with that, we are closing the session. On behalf of the Economic Times, I would like to thank you all for joining this webinar. Once you log off, automatically a window will open to capture your feedback. And thank you once again for joining the Economic Times live webinar powered by Sophos. Thank you, Ben. Have a good day.